Hello, fellow Rebel Capitals. Hope you're well. So, the government just came out and released a report regarding Social Security payments. I think everyone needs to pay attention to this. I think most Rebel Capitalists know that the security fund is going bust very quickly, but I don't think people realize how urgent this is and why we should be concerned with the fact that the Social Security payments or the Social Security fund itself is going bust in the United States. It's kind of a slow moving train wreck, but it's getting quicker, faster, 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 and faster. And I think it's something with all the other headlines in the mainstream media with what's happening in the Middle East, with what's happening with the Fed, what's happening with tariffs, that we kind of forget, oh, yeah, all these payments that are due to all these retirees, they might not be there. And if they are there, what does that tell us about government spending at large? And what does that tell us about the impacts on the overall economy? I think that's the main takeaway here. So let's go over to CNBC. Then we're going to go into this report specifically that outlines the details. So right here, CNBC, headline, Social Security Retirement Trust Fund may be depleted in less than a decade. Now you say, oh, George, that's 2033, they're saying, or 2034. Who cares? Well, what you need to realize is every single year they come out with this report, their time frame in which the Social Security payments, or some of them, will run out or not be able to be made decreases. So as an example, the report last year said the D-Day, if you will, was 2035. And then this year it goes down to 2033. And then so you see the trend, right? And I think these reports assume that there's going to be a lot more economic activity than there likely will be. It assumes higher interest rate payments. It assumes all these things that in the past haven't come to fruition. And I think it's an overly optimistic prediction that I think will get more and more dire. And if we're at 2033 right now, I would not be surprised if this is sub 2030 next year or the year after, which means that assuming it's the year after, 2026, 2027, then you're only 3 years away from the Social Security Department not being able to cut checks. Let's get into it here. The key talking points the trust fund Social Security relies on to help pay retirement benefits may be depleted by 2033. And I think it'll probably be a lot faster than that if you look at the trend on where these projections have been in the past, at which point 77% of those benefits would be payable. Okay, again, I think overly optimistic. Now, I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Social Security won't be there. It will, but you have to ask at what cost. And I'm not talking about just the dollar amount. I'll show you what I'm referring to in just a moment. The program's combined trust funds, which also includes disability insurance, may run out by 2034. And just think how much of the United States economy is propped up by transfer payments. If it's not Social Security, disability, other forms of, let's just say, welfare, this is a large, large percentage of overall economic output, consumer spending. They say advocates for Social Security beneficiaries said Congress should act as soon as possible to avoid benefit shortfalls. Now, I think they get the problem wrong because their view, they're like, oh no, we're going to run out of money and the United States government isn't going to be able to issue the treasuries without increasing the interest rate. And therefore, that may be the constraint. Therefore, we need to cut government spending right now in order so we can spend in the future. Now, I think that's totally misguided because that puts the emphasis on the bond market as though the problem is in the treasury market long into the curve blowing out as far as interest rates. That's not the problem. The problem is the economic distortions that are created by the government spending to begin with. I'll show you what I'm referring to in just a moment. So trust fund, okay, we got that. We got that. Okay, we've got all of the nitty gritty here. Let's go over to the actual report. And this is from the Social Security Office, released today, June 18th. Social Security Board of Trustees, projection for combined trust funds 1 year sooner than last. You see what I'm talking about? So they're like, oh, hey, we're just waving this white flag or red flag that's last year we told you it was going to be 2035. And this year it looks like 2034, 2033. So I don't have any reason to assume that in 2026, they're going to ratchet that down to 2030, 2031, maybe 2029, when the more realistic numbers show themselves, and they have to actually admit the probably the more conservative numbers, as opposed to looking at this through rose-colored glasses. The Social Security Board trustees today released an annual report on financial status of Social Security Trust Fund combined reserves of old age and survivors insurance disability. Okay, trust funds are projected to have enough dedicated revenue to pay, are projected. But again, every single time, every single year this comes out, the projections get worse. So they said they're good to go as of right now to 2034. But then once that year hits, assuming these projections are correct, then 81% of the benefits are going to be payable. Then a subcomponent of that is what they're referencing for 2033, with 77% of the payments being payable then, which I assume would decrease every single year. The key points here, executive summary: the reserves of the combined trust funds declined by $67 billion in 2024 to a total of $2.72 trillion. The total annual cost of the program is projected to exceed total annual income in 2025. So you see, we're already on a completely unsustainable path, to use that word. And they're going to remain higher throughout the 75. Okay, got it. Total cost began to become higher in 2021. So they started losing money. The funds started to be depleted, if you will, in 2021. Social Security costs have exceeded its non-interest income since 2010. So it's not like it's a brand new problem. If Congress doesn't act, combined trust fund reserves are currently projected to become depleted. Okay, we got that. Here's a quote: to ensure we serve public, deliver high quality service to the 185 million who work and pay payroll taxes for Social Security, and the 70 million beneficiaries who receive benefits during 25, the financial status of the trust. So you see, this a large component of this assumes that payroll taxes are probably going to be the same and increase at a certain percentage per year. But if we go into a recession, what happens to payroll taxes? Well, as you guys know, they're going to go down. And what happens to the government's need to go ahead and go over to that Social Security kitty and say, oh, let's just go ahead and we'll put an IOU here, and then we'll just go ahead and use this Social Security fund to go ahead and pay XYZ, to go ahead and pay, who knows, the next world war or whatever it's going to go pay for. Whatever we've kind of robbed the piggy bank in the past, I'm sure that will continue, if not get worse. But my main point is saying that this is dependent upon payroll taxes and a projection for payroll taxes that is likely way overly optimistic. Here's another quote: Congress, along with Social Security Administration and others committed to eliminate waste, fraud, abuse, must work together to protect and strengthen the trust funds for millions of Americans who rely on it. And by the way, let's go back to the 185 million people here. How much purchasing power does that equal? Let's just assume for a moment that it did go down to even 77%. I mean, what is the hit on GDP there? And the hit on GDP would have to be trillions of dollars. And then what's the government going to do? And then what's going to happen to payroll tax? What's going to happen to the unemployment rate? You see, you get into this doom loop because so much of our economic activity is dependent on these transfer payments, as opposed to being dependent on productivity. We've got two components that really prop up the United States economy: transfer payments and asset prices. And I would argue both of those are unsustainable without extreme negative damage to the economy. I'm not saying they're unsustainable from a standpoint of people getting paid, but they're unsustainable from a standpoint of having avoiding a huge negative impact on the standard of living. And I'll show you how I'm connecting those dots in a moment here. So total expenditures amounted to 1.48 trillion in 2024. Keep in mind their total fund is 2.7 trillion. So this shows you how reliant even this 2033 or 2034 projection is on the current rate of payroll taxes. And I'm assuming that increasing at a high percentage, an overly optimistic percentage every single year. 184 million had earnings covered by Social Security. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a big hit to the economy. Look at this. The projected deficit over the 75 long range period is 3.82% of taxable payroll, higher than the 3.5 projected last year. You see, every single year it just gets worse and worse and worse. And you know, so I think next year or the year after, the numbers or the year isn't going to be 2033. The year is going to be 2029 or oh, whoops, sorry, it's this year, 2027. I wouldn't doubt it, especially if we go through a significant recession, which decreases those payroll taxes substantially. But now let's go over to the real problem here. Because the way this is presented as though it's a problem in the treasury market. So we've got to do something now. We've got to cut government spending because we have to allow for this additional spending in the future. And because the retirees have to get paid, and the disability and the welfare and the Medicaid and Medicare, all of these, let's just say, things that people have been promised. So then the argument there is, well, we got to cut government spending because we have to allow for this additional spending in the future because we can't rely on treasury issuance because that's going to increase supply, that's going to increase interest rates. That's not going to happen because interest rates are a reflection of growth and inflation expectations, right? And if anything, what the government is doing there as far as these transfer payments are not necessarily inflationary, but they're anti-deflationary. And the bad kind of deflation, by the way. So my point here is that if we have to allocate more future government spending to Medicare, to Social Security payments, then they're going to have to issue more bonds. And again, the problem there isn't the supply of bonds, but the problem is the increased government spending itself. Right? So right now, like we said earlier, a big portion of GDP is transfer payments. So if these transfer payments are going to increase, we can assume that the rest of the government spending outside of the transfer payments is going to increase as well. So then what we assume is that moving into 2027, 2028, 2030, when we really start to run up against some problems here, assuming we have a recession and the payroll taxes come in light based on their projections, then we have government spending as a percentage of GDP increasing. And this is the problem. So I don't think you're going to see the problem in the bond market or the treasury market with interest rates blowing out, because the long end of the curve has never really been about supply. It's always been about growth and inflation expectations. And if we see the economy starting to not just decline, but the economy start to slow down, and we see an economy like we saw, let's just say in the 2010s, then what this means is the overall government spending as a percent of GDP increases. So you have the private sector decreasing, you have the government spending increasing due to not just the Social Security payments, but due to all the other increases in the government deficits, as we're seeing with the complete failure of DOGE. It's a good idea, but in practice, it isn't working. So then what you have is government spending as a percentage of GDP increasing, 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 and this makes the economy more and more and more inefficient. And this lowers the standard of living. To give you an example, let's go back to the late 1800s, and we can see, and keep in mind, this is state and local. State and local. When you combine federal, state, and local, the overall government spending as a percentage of GDP is right around 5%. So that means 95% of economic output was a result of the private sector. Now it's 40%. And this is, by the way, 2018. Now it's closer to 50%. So just think how much lower the standard of living is today with the government spending at 50% than it would have been if we never would have gone above 5%. In other words, think about what the standard of living would be right now for the United States, or how efficient the economy would be if government spending was only 5% and the private sector represented 95%. But what I'm saying here, the real problem is when you look at these projections, these terrifying projections from Social Security, we don't have to worry about this really impacting long into the curve. Maybe it will through inflation, but it's not through supply. What we really have to see is, okay, if this goes from 50% to 60%, which it's likely going to, because we're not going to reduce the deficits, those are going to increase. And on top of that, you have more and more spending being allocated to these transfer payments. Then what happens if we go to 60%, 70%? I mean, take it to an extreme. You go to 100% of GDP being government spending, and you're in communist Russia. And we know how inefficient that economy was. And we know what that did to the standard of living for the Russians who had to deal with it for decades and decades and decades and decades. So then I think the big question becomes, what do you do about this? And I've been talking about this a lot lately on the channel, but I think it's worth mentioning again. For me, in my portfolios, and this is not investment advice, but all roads lead to gold. And I'm not saying that gold is 100% of my portfolio or anything like that. It's usually, when I start a portfolio, it's usually about 10%. But it's like all roads lead to, not necessarily inflation, but all roads lead to uncertainty. And I think uncertainty is what usually gives gold a bid. Now, will that uncertainty give other, let's say Bitcoin as an example, will it give that a bid? I don't know. Because I don't have 5,000 years of history on it. And silver, I don't know. But gold is something where I think there's a high probability. So I have now, especially because I've been allocating 10%, and as gold goes up and up in price, it becomes a bigger percentage of my portfolio. But the problem here that I have, and I found a solution for that I want to share with you guys. The problem that I have right now is the gold storage cost is a percentage of the value of the gold. So if I buy X amount of gold, let's say $20,000 of gold at $1,000 an ounce, and it goes up to $3,000 an ounce, well, guess what happens to my storage fees? Well, they go up 3x. Even though I still have the exact same amount of ounces in storage, it doesn't matter, right? So I want to tell you about the company that's been sponsoring some of the videos lately, and this is Monetary Metals. And what they do is they offer a solution to this problem. It's a very good solution. So what they do is they have gold leasing programs. If you want to figure out the model or understand it a little bit better, Josh will put an explainer video in the description. But I'm good buddies with Keith, and he's the one that came to me initially with this idea that, hey, maybe we could sponsor some of your videos. And I said, well, I've never really taken on a sponsor, and if I do, I've got to set up an account for myself to really see how it works. And so far, it's worked great. I've got about $40,000 plus of gold with them, and I've been involved with some of their lease programs. And what they do is it's really for jewelers who want to hedge out the fluctuation of the gold price. They want to hedge that out with the inventory that they have. And so if you're looking for a way to alleviate this problem, so many of you are cheerleaders for gold, rightfully so, because you own a lot of it, or precious metals, silver as well. and you're sitting there, yay, the price goes up. Awesome, the price goes up. It goes up again. But then you don't think about the fact that if you have this on storage, not only is the price going up, but your fees are going up. So again, the great thing about monetary metals is they actually pay you to store their gold with them because they use that gold in their leasing programs with these jewelers. And the interest rate that they pay you, I think I'm getting paid between 3 and 4% right now, but it's paid in precious metals. It's not just paid in fiat currency. So if you want to find out more about what they do, you can call them up to say that George sent you. And their customer service is great. They'll be happy to answer any of your questions. And if you want to watch that explainer video to see if this is something that might be right for you, I'd highly suggest doing so. All right, guys, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. As always, make sure you are standing up for freedom, liberty, free market capitalism, and I will see you on the next video.